There has been a lot of information floating around out there about COVID. Positive, negative, truthful, and misinformation, as the mainstream often likes to say, nowadays. Having spent a good deal of time looking into the various questions and concerns surrounding COVID-19, and having a medical background myself, I felt it would be beneficial and helpful to give those of you who are floundering in facts and uncertainty some helpful information and facts. To start off, it should be noted that COVID is still a relatively new disease. As such, the medical community is still learning about its various effects on those individuals who get infected with it. There are, however, many things that we know with a very good degree of certainty. So let's start with those. COVID-19 began its spread in China sometime in mid to late 2019. The original origin hypothesis was that this respiratory disease came from either a local market, through poor sanitation or improper cooking, or that it somehow was transferred to humans through bats or pangolins. However, the lack of an explicitly identified animal patient zero, plus the realization that certain parts of the coronavirus genome appear to be genetically modified, by this I mean that there were genetic stretches that we only see in viruses altered in a lab. And all this added to the many too good to be true coincidences surrounding the location and emergence of the virus, have led more and more members of the scientific and lay communities to begin to seriously entertain the idea that the virus originated in a lab. There is no direct evidence thus far that it was purposely released, but the evidence that it came from a lab is mounting. I will pause to point out the irony of the fact that I said I would start with the stuff that we know for certain, and almost immediately I jumped into things that are still unclear. Well, let me return from my tangential wandering, and discuss more certain topics. Let us begin with risk factors. The primary risk factor for COVID is age. The older you are, the more significantly you'll be affected if you get infected. The same goes for those who have any of a wide range of serious health problems. These include obesity, diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, and immunodeficiencies. The more of these you have, the more likely you are to have a more severe case of COVID, and the more likely you are to die from it. Those who are younger, specifically under the age of 40, those who exercise regularly, who are not overweight, and who are otherwise generally healthy have a much lower likelihood of dying from COVID. Children are the least likely to die of COVID. Even now, years into the pandemic, the number of children in the US who have died from COVID number only in the hundreds. Every death is a tragedy, of course. But when compared to the millions of children in the United States, and when compared to the many children who have been infected with COVID, the number of deaths is very small. Looking at simply the raw data, we can easily say that COVID is significantly less deadly than the flu for children, and it is significantly more dangerous than the flu for anyone older than 50. But how would you know if you've had COVID? The answer to this question varies by individual. But broadly speaking, those who have COVID will likely have a fever, sore throat, cough, fatigue, and the now iconic loss of taste and smell. A positive COVID test would be a way to confirm an infection. Once you have confirmed that you have COVID, you will likely be wondering if there are any treatments or medications you can take to lessen your symptoms or prevent long-term harm. The unfortunate answer is that the jury is still out on what the best treatments are for use during infection. If you have a serious case of COVID, and you could probably also do this for a mild or modest case, it would be smart to speak to your physician about monoclonal antibody therapy. This treatment has been shown to be widely effective, especially in the early stages of the infection. It also has relatively few risks. It should also be noted that COVID has been associated with increased clots and microthrombi. The best data seems to tell us that this is due to the hyper-inflammatory effects of COVID on the human body, especially on the immune system and vascular system. So, a good starting point would be to speak to your doctor about the use of a blood thinner or anticoagulant. Something as mild as aspirin has been shown to have a positive impact in reducing COVID infection-related morbidity and mortality. Depending on your particular situation, your doctor might feel that something as strong as heparin or warfarin might be a good choice for you. Again, every individual case might be slightly different, and it is important to speak with a doctor you trust. In terms of reducing inflammation, there are non-prescription supplements you can try. These would include turmeric and vitamin C. Research earlier this year seemed to show that certain anti-arthritic medication might have a beneficial impact on reducing the inflammatory effects of COVID on the body, and turmeric has some of the same active compounds. It has also been shown to have anti-inflammatory properties itself. Vitamin C has some antioxidant properties, and may thus be beneficial for similar reasons. Vitamin D should also become a regular supplement. We do not fully understand the relationship between COVID and vitamin D, but it has been demonstrated that those who had the worst cases of COVID also were very vitamin D deficient. And finally, we get to Rivamectin. This anti-parasitic drug has received a lot of flack and praise, from those who feel its rise to fame sits on unproven terrain, and from those who see it as a potential beneficial treatment. The truth is that the jury is still out. What we do know is that ivermectin has been shown to have some anti-inflammatory and antiviral properties in addition to being an anti-parasitic. We also know that it inhibits the activity of COVID when exposed in vitro. Meaning, in a lab environment, not in human or animal subjects. This all seems very promising. We also have many studies showing some medium certainty and high certainty evidence that ivermectin has a positive impact on those individuals infected with COVID. However, there are also a good deal of studies that show no benefit to taking ivermectin for COVID. There are numerous clinical studies currently taking place to attempt to finally answer this question, and we will just have to wait until they are complete to get an actual final answer. That being said, ivermectin has a decades-long history and a very well-known safety profile. If taken in the proper dosage, under physician supervision, there is very little chance the person taking it will be harmed by it. Therefore, in the risk analysis, it might be better to take it with the hope that it might work, since the potential harms are small but the potential benefits may be rather large. I must emphasize, as I have been, that any of these decisions should only be made after thorough and proper discussion with your doctor. And finally, let us discuss the vaccines. The data is very clear on one point. If you get vaccinated, you will not die from COVID. Even if you have a breakthrough infection. If you get vaccinated, there is a 0.001% chance that you will die from COVID. Practically speaking, that is a statistical impossibility. This includes the risk of dying from a COVID variant. There is a higher chance that you will have a breakthrough infection with a variant compared to the original virus. But even so, the chance of you dying from a COVID variant post-vaccination is very, very low. There is and will continue to be the question of whether it was a smart idea to vaccinate a large population, in the middle of an active pandemic. The wiser choice would probably have been to vaccinate the higher-risk populations, while developing the most effective non-vaccine treatments for those who are at substantially lower risk. However, that ship has sailed, and it is most likely because of this that we have variants here. variants that were evolutionarily forced to develop and outcompete the alpha strain, because they had a better chance of infecting the vaccinated masses. So the only question that matters now is whether or not you should get vaccinated. It is important to point out that any doctor worth their salt will admit that the data shows the COVID vaccines are more commonly correlated with a lot more adverse effects than we normally see with vaccines. Most of these adverse effects are mild, but they exist nonetheless. There are a small handful of more significant adverse effects with some of the vaccines, and these should also be discussed with one's doctor before choosing a vaccine. Pfizer and Moderna carry a very slight increased risk of myocarditis for younger males. Johnson & Johnson has a very slight increased risk of Guillain-Barré syndrome for older male adults, and it also has a very slight increased risk of major clotting for younger women. These are very, very slight risks, but they do exist and should be mentioned. The vaccines also seem to have a decreased effect against variants, as the virus mutates to take advantage of the weak points in the vaccine. At the same time, mounting evidence is leaning in the direction of saying that those who have been infected and recovered have developed so-called natural immunity. Natural immunity that seems to be stronger and more robust than vaccine-mediated immunity. Does this mean you should get infected instead of getting vaccinated? Not necessarily. Though they are not perfect, the vaccines still provide a significant amount of protection, and even breakthrough cases are substantially milder. The only real question is, what are the potential long-term risks of the vaccines? Very small and insignificant, most likely. But we don't fully know. New research is showing that the increased risk of clotting due to COVID is caused by the COVID spike protein. And it is this same spike protein that is produced by the vaccines. It is true that there is significantly less spike protein production and distribution after a vaccination, when compared to a COVID infection. But it is nonetheless still present. Having said all that, if you are older or in a higher risk category, then you should very strongly consider getting vaccinated. If you are younger and not in one of the higher risk categories, then this is a decision you should speak to your doctor about. Make the best choice for you, one that you are comfortable with. Do not fall to conspiracy theories from either side. Realize that this is a choice best made for yourself. The risks are low, the benefits are high, and the likelihood of harm is greater from COVID than from the vaccine. But make sure to speak with your doctor first. If you have made it this far, I want to thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. Hopefully I will see you all again very soon.